Hello chess fans, today I'm going to show you a game from the Aeroflot Open where 14-year-old international master Aydin Suleymanli won first prize. Now, he's not even a grandmaster yet, and he started the event ranked 71st, but with a string of 3 very impressive wins against Magsudlu, against Smirin, and here against Durarbayli. He managed to push his way into sole first place and hold on to his lead spot in the final round. Now, in this game against Durarbayli, we are going to see absolute chaos on the board, including variations like this one, where you can have 3 or even 4 passed pawns pushing past the 6th and even the 7th rank. Let's see how we got into this crazy position. The game opens up with e4 from Durarbayli, and we get a Caro-Kann from Suleymanli. We're going to see here the advanced variation, one of the sharper variations, and Suleymanli is going to play natural moves including queen b6 attacking b2, but he chooses not to go after the b2 pawn right away, and now knight a4 attacks the queen, trying to disrupt it, and it defends this b2 pawn. Queen a5 check, pawn to c3, which does defend the knight here because we were able to move that pawn up that was blocking the queen. Pawn to c4. And this is really trying to exploit the position of the knight. It doesn't really have a way back into the white camp, so it's going to have to go forward here into the c5 square where black can exchange it off. Knight h4, the knights adopt posts on either rim. Evidently, Durarbayli's never heard the saying, knights on the rim are grim. But to be fair, he's about to exchange one off, and the other one's going to hop into c5 when black will need to exchange it off because it will be too strong. We see here b5, forcing the variations we're referencing here. Knight takes f5, pawn takes, and knight c5, bishop takes, and pawn takes. If you're going to put 2 knights on the rim, then I guess the best thing you can say is in 2 moves, I've managed to trade off both of them, which white has. This produces a very interesting and imbalanced position that's probably pretty balanced. Balanced and imbalanced at the same time. Imbalanced in that white has a bishop pair and a worse pawn structure, right? While black has a pair of knights, which probably work well in a semi-closed position like this one, and balanced just in that the position should be about equal. A long struggle ahead, of course, though. After knight g to e7, white could have played something simple like f4, and again, seems about equal, long struggle ahead. However, we get a mistake here from Durarbayli, pawn to b4. What's wrong with this move that the grandmaster didn't appreciate? I think the problem with b4, which looks like it's making a nice solid pawn structure here, is that it is weakening c3, which black goes after right away with queen a3. And also it's closing the position a little bit, and black has 2 knights and white has 2 bishops. So you want to play in a way that is going to open the position more. Also, the specific tactical concerns are a real issue. Strongest now was queen c1, which avoids tactical issues by trying to force the queens off the board. But it has positional issues because, of course, after a queen trade, the knights are actually doing pretty well here. Now, after queen a3, instead of queen c1 trying to trade queens, we saw queen c2. But now pawn to d4, tearing out the defender of this b4 pawn, and that's going to produce a good structure for Suleymanli. C takes d4, knight takes, or queen takes b4 check, queen to d2. And in this position, a good move was rook to d8, just keeping a nice hold on the position. Black has a passed c pawn. White does have connected passed pawns right here, but black has really good control over the blockading squares, so white shouldn't be able to make progress. This position should be very favorable for black, maybe objectively close to winning. If you really want to play it sassy, you can, instead of just castling or just playing rook d8, you can even castle here and throw your king over to c8. But that certainly seems maybe a bit riskier than just playing rook d8 and castling normally, so your king is not a concern. In any case, though, Suleymanli tried pawn to a5 here, staking his chances on advancing on the queen side with the pawns, but this does allow white a good move that will break up the pawn structure. That is the move pawn to a4, trying to tear out this linchpin that's keeping black's nice structure together. So now we do see a counter blow from Suleymanli, that is pawn to f4, trying to get the bishop to move so that knight takes d4 is possible. Of course, the queen is pinned, and now this position is just a wreck for white. Black is pretty close to winning right here. So after f4, the idea for Durarbayli is to sacrifice this bishop. It is really hard here and in the moves that came before this and in the moves that are coming after this to say how much the players had actually seen. There's a lot of times that Stockfish's evaluation is going way up or way down, but it's not clear whether the players in the moment may have realized they were making objective mistakes according to Stockfish, or they're struggling to they're struggling to properly evaluate the in positions where there are all these crazy passed pawns. The position is very irrational, and it's not easy for a human, without looking at Stockfish or having a lot of time to look at the position to know what's going on. I think without an engine, I'm not sure that any amount of analysis is enough for a human to really know what's going on in this game. So A takes b5, sacrificing this e3 bishop. Suleymanli throws in the move pawn c3, which attacks the white queen, and the queen steps up to d3. Now Suleymanli does take here, f takes e3. So black is up a piece and has two passed pawns, but white has this massive set of pawns right here, three of which are connected and passed. So this is a very, very unclear position. Queen to b2 now, attacking this rook on a1, castling and defending the rook. Knight b4, queen b2 freed the square for the knight, and now the queen goes to e4, attacks the rook on a8, and black castles. So both players had the pleasure of attacking a rook in the corner and castling to defend said rook attacked in the corner. An amusing symmetry there. Now bishop c4, going after this f7 pawn right here, and the best move from Suleymanli is pawn to c2 when this pawn is starting to create back rank issues for white. For example, if you take on f7, of course we can't take because this rook would hang over here, but when we move over, there are more problems for white on the back rank. You're not happy to have won the f7 pawn, it's irrelevant, and you're actually in serious trouble here thanks to threats such as after pawn h3 here, simply queen c3 right here, and then knight d3. This looks good enough and very, very hard to find a defense to this. So pawn c2, now rook a c1 right here. Rook a to d8. Queen c3 was actually really good on this move. You didn't need rook a d8. And now bishop d3, threatening mate right here. Of course, we're going to stop that. Pawn to g6. And the white pawns are starting to go. Now, they're not that close to promoting yet, but in a few moves, they're going to be really close to promotion, and white is going to start to have promoting combinations here where you give up material to get your pawns to advance. Knight e d5, the knight looks great here, and the knight might hop into c3. For example, bishop takes c2, knight c3, the queen moves, and then knight a b2, and you've got problems here and here, and black is looking close to winning this game, although pawn to e6 will still create some counterplay. I'm going to move on, but you can analyze the resulting position still for quite a while. After knight e to d5 here, the bishop does go back to c4. Now queen c3, the best move when there are ideas to capture here on e3. So the bishop captures on d5. The bishop was being attacked by the queen here. And now you have two choices, rook takes or knight takes. If knight takes d5, then white can win the c2 pawn here. But after queen takes e3 and a trade, there is a fork right here. Now, this does not end the game yet, because even though you're winning a rook here, this position is still very, very difficult for black to win. Probably black is better, although the only move according to the engine is rook b8, and after all other moves, white is better. So this position is still absolute chaos, and these three connected passed pawns give white very good compensation. I am sure that I could lose this position with either color. This isn't what Suleymanli went for, though. After bishop takes d5, he picked rook takes d5 in this position. And after rook takes d5, we saw b7 from Durarbayli, again sending those pawns up the board and hoping for counterplay. Rook to b8 from black, hoping to just take this right here and end all counterplay. If rook takes b7, then white really doesn't have good play. Now, this is a critical moment for Durarbayli, and he has one tempting move and one computer move to choose from. Now, the tempting move is pawn to e6, which he played, but then pawn to f5 was a problem, as we'll see. So the computer move that seems to be correct is pawn to g4. Now, if a human played this, I really think that one should be going, did they have a pocket PDA in the bathroom or something like that? Because this move is absolutely insane. Very hard for me to imagine a human playing this move in this position. The point of g4 is to stop pawn to f5 and to threaten e6, because f5 was the only good move to meet e6, and that's what black did in the game. So if you stop f5 in response to e6, black doesn't have a very good response to e6 on the next turn. In fact, rook takes b7 actually makes e6 stronger, because now if you were to try pawn to f5, then the e7 pawn can just push forward, or the e6 pawn can push forward to e7. So huge problem right there. In fact, after g4, rook takes b7, pawn to e6, in this position, the only chess move that works for black is king to f8. Everything else is losing. That is just absolutely insane and a testament to how complicated this position is. Now, again, after rook b8, I do not want to say that Durarbayli missed g4, but he didn't play this computer move that seems to be the strongest available move. Instead, he played the immediate pawn e6, and then pawn f5 came from Suleymanli. I can't say whether Durarbayli had missed something after this, or he just didn't think he had anything better than pawn e6 to f5. Suffice to say, though, the position, although Stockfish is liking black, is very complicated still, and it's absolutely crazy for a human in this position to really hope to know exactly what's going on. There's still all kinds of crazy complications that ensue, and I wonder if Durarbayli had anticipated this, because now he sacrifices, and maybe he missed some defense after these sacrifices for Suleymanli and thought that he was actually going to be able to promote. So after pawn to f5, you don't want to just move the queen away, because then simply rook takes b7 and black is in full control. For example, queen f4, rook takes b7. So f5 has hit the queen. We respond with rook takes c2. Now you can't take with the knight, because then this rook hangs right here. So you have to take with the queen, but you're winning a rook here. Queen takes and knight takes. Now, pause to count. The count is both players have a rook, nice and even. But then black has a knight and a rook in addition, and in return, white has these four connected pass pawns. This is the most definitional example of Space Invaders that I have ever seen. Space Invaders is a reference to, of course, the classic video game, and the idea that these pawns are pushing forward just like those video game, little sprites that are trying to reach the back here, and black, is firing these bullets here, trying to stop the pawns right here. So in this position, c6, and now you're threatening pawn to c7, and then you're going to promote and you're going to be winning. This is a good point to pause your video and try and figure out what the only move that works is for black right here. So that only move that works is rook to b5. And this isn't too hard, so I assume both players probably anticipated this. Rook to b5 from Suleymanli intending after pawn to c7 to give back one rook right here. And after you eliminate these pawns, then the rook and the knight should be able to easily contain these pawns. And also black's king is nearby. This should be an easily winning position for black. However, after rook to b5, the tricks keep coming. We here see pawn to d5. Now, you can't take this because then c7 and you no longer are in position to give a rook back to eliminate the pawns. So you're going to have to allow promotion here. The best move for black right here is to go rook d to d8. And in fact, white is winning right here after c takes here, queen, rook takes e7. Now your rook needs to move and block one of these pawns. You can pick e8 or b8. It doesn't really change anything. And then rook to d1 in this position. And you're coming in to the d8 square and you're going to win the game. Not rook to c1 here, which goes after the knight because black is just going to give the knight back to stop everything, king f7, and you win the knight, but both pawns get eliminated and black is actually a bit better. Crazy, crazy stuff. So after pawn to d5 here, we should mention the viable defenses for black. Now, there are a couple of good options. One is rook to c5, not played by Suleymanli. This is actually probably the best move because the problem for white is that there's just no obvious way to make progress in this position. And knight b4 is coming, and black is going to be able to mop up, I think, relatively easily. So rook c5 here, a very patient move that just says you can't push c7 because I'm going to take, you can't push d6 because I'll take this. I'm just intending to play my knight back to b4, and then the knight can do the mopping up while the rooks restrain the pawns. So this seems very convincing. Another interesting alternative after pawn to d5 is knight takes e3. Now, this gets really hairy because after pawn to d6, with four connected passed pawns, I just feel like that needs to be said more than once. You can't take the whole rook down here on f1 because after knight takes f1, when black is up two rooks and a knight in this position, white is winning the game here if you play pawn to d7 and you're just intending c7 or e7, you know, there is no defense for black in this position. The Space Invaders are definitely landing on the back rank, which is hilarious. You can try for some counterplay here where you try to go after the white king, but the king is able to evade any checkmates and any perpetual checks. So you're going to win the game as white. So after pawn to d6 in this position, black would be forced to here to play rook takes b7 here. And then after c takes b7, you're able to stop everything. And in fact, you have knight takes f1 here, winning the game. The king is helping out here and is also able to stop the pawns. If the king was a little further away, then white would surely be winning. If you put the king over on h8, surely most of these lines would just crash through. I can also mention here that after rook takes b7, white can throw in the move d7 here, choosing not to take the rook that was just sacrificed back, choosing to leave this rook hanging here. And the only move that works for black is king to f8. So there's only one move in this position, but this is sufficient. White is not able to crash through with the pawns. You can take back a little material, but not enough material, and black should be able to win this crazy, crazy game. All right, more crazy variations. This game could just be called the Crazy Variations game. After d5, you can also go king f8. And this actually seems to be a mistake. In the game, king g7 was played. And my question when I was, first looking at this is, why not play king f8? That seems better than king g7. But Suleymanli is right. This is, I think, a really impressive decision. King f8 is a mistake because the king is actually more exposed to checks and to back rank issues than if the king is on g7. So he picked the right square, approaching the pawns, but not allowing himself to get in back rank issues or awkward checks from this pawn advancing to e7. After king to f8, white would play pawn to d6 here. And if you take this rook, or take this pawn and attack the rook right here with knight takes e3, then you would have e7 check. Again, because the king is on f8, we have this e7 check. King e8, d7 check, king takes e7. You're like, hey, I got my king into position and I eliminated a critical pawn, but there are still 3 connected pass pawns left. That is now 3 connected pass pawns on the 7th rank. We know that 2 connected pass pawns on the 6th rank are better than a rook. That's a really classic bit of chess knowledge. Well, 3 connected pass pawns on the 7th rank turn out to be better than pretty much everything, and they win the game right here for white, which I find just hilarious. This position is absolutely delightful. You would be able to save the game if in this position, instead of taking on e3 and greedily attacking this rook, you immediately gave back material with rook takes b7. But this is not enough to win the game. Rook c1, attacking the knight and moving the rook out of the way here is a strong move. You cannot do knight takes e3 and move the knight, because after c takes b7, we see the problems I was talking about. The king is exposed to checks here. So if you do rook takes b7, check, and then d7, because you had to move your king away from the pawns when you stepped out of that check here, and this would win for white. Whew. Okay, so after all of these crazy variations here, let's back up and go back to the position after pawn to d5 right here. So Suleymanli did not find the best move, rook c5, right? He also didn't play knight takes e3, which is good if you're very careful. Instead, he picked the third move that is close to winning, king g7 here. Again, better than king f8, which walks into some of those checks that we just saw. So king g7. And now pawn to d6 from white, establishing 3 connected pass pawns on the 6th, plus a bonus pass pawn here on the 7th rank on b7. Now, the best move for black here was knight to b4, getting that knight back in and just giving back that knight for the c6 pawn. Of course, if c7, then you're going to give your rook back, and after rook c1 defending that pawn, then black is just in a position to take on c6, and black is in a good position to try to win the game here, and actually, at least black is much, much better in the resulting endgames. So after pawn to d6 here, the king approaches with king to f6. This is a bit of a mistake. Again, knight b4 was better, and white now had an opportunity. It does go missed, though. That opportunity is pawn to e7 here, when the pawns are obviously looking tremendously dangerous, and we're looking to get that c7 and d7 3 connected pass pawns in the 7th rank situation that we had a moment ago in one of our critical variations. So black must give back material. Now rook takes b7, and after c takes b7, then king e6 is critical. You've got to try and stop these pawns. Of course, you can't take here because you're trying to stop this pawn. So king e6 is the strongest move right here. And then after rook d1, we're threatening to crash through here. King d7 blockading everything, and now rook c1 attacking the knight and trying to get in here, and black must give up the knight to eliminate the pawns. King takes d6, and this endgame is simply equal here. You're going to trade these 2 pawns for each other, and even though black has, it's 3 versus 3 pawns, the pawn structure doesn't matter. It's a dead draw here. So white could have drawn the game if after king f6, e7 was played right here. White could have drawn. Instead, white selected the move d7 here, and this proves to be the losing move. Maybe he was thinking of something like king e7 when c7 and the 3 pass pawns on the 7th rank win the game. There's one good move here. You can pause your video and try and figure out what it is. it is the move rook c5, which Suleymanli does play. This holds the c7 pawn back. Of course, the king is holding back this e6 pawn, so these pawns are not able to advance. And after rook to d1, which is threatening to promote right here, so that after the trade of the rooks, after you promote, this b7 pawn can push through. Black can just physically stop the pawn with rook to d8 in this position. So black is staying in front of the pawn. And now you don't have a kind of perpetual with rook b1 when the rook goes back and the two rooks go back and forth between d1 and b1. That almost seems like it could work as a perpetual, but black here can just block this with knight b4. And now there's no way for white to make progress, and black is simply mopping up these pawns right here. So after rook to d8, Durarbayli tried to move pawn to e4 in this position. And Suleymanli pulled back with king to e7. He's focusing just on blockading and eliminating these pawns. He doesn't need to open any lines for this rook to create problems. E takes f5, g takes f5. And now after rook to d5, which is the 41st move, I think that there must have been a time control at move 40. Durarbayli did resign right after playing rook d5. This is very clever and really fun as a final move for white. But of course, Suleymanli is not going to take here on d5 when, again, c7, 3 connected passed pawns on the 7th rank beat everything. But after rook d5, he can simply play rook takes c6. Now, rook to b5 actually looks tricky because you don't get to block with knight b4 like we saw a moment ago with the rook going to b1. But here black has a lot of choices that will eliminate everything. For example, simple is just king takes e6. And after a promotion here, then the d7 pawn also gets eliminated and black is totally winning. But there are other ways to win as well. So rook d5 concluded this crazy game. That was just an absolute blast. I really hope that you enjoyed all of those variations and positions as much as I did. I think I'm going to call this one for my own for my own personal amusement, the Immortal Space Invaders game. If you want to see other Immortal games, then you can click right on top of the chessboard over here. And as always, you can subscribe to the channel if you want to see more chess videos.